The afternoon slate was pretty entertaining. The big one obviously was Texas A&M and Miami. Two teams that were looking to bounce back after 5 and 7 seasons, two teams that hoped that their offenses would take steps forward. And we saw that today. We saw these offenses create big plays. They look drastically different than the last time they played, which was last year. And the result was kind of surprising in a way. I don't think anybody expected Miami to run away with this one with a double-digit win. Maybe not run away, but definitely was in control for a lot of the game and definitely felt like they were the better team for most of that contest. We start with, I think that the slow start for Miami is what probably concerned a lot of people. You had a three and out, you had a blocked kick, you had a muffed punt. There were a lot of things that weren't going Miami's way, and it kind of felt like here we go again, kind of one of those things. But they found a way to get things going and figure things out. And you kind of have to look at the offense and what they were able to do, and we'll start there. The first thing we have to talk about is Shannon Dawson's arrival and the masterpiece that was his play calling on Saturday. You look at what Tyler Van Dyke was able to do, and a lot of that can be attributed to Shannon Dawson. And one of the concerns I had about Shannon Dawson was he comes from Dana Holgerson's system where in his last two stops with Dana Holgerson, they had success. When he's ventured out on his own, it hasn't been as great. But this clearly was a great start to his time with Miami. I think so far we've seen a lot of good things. And the one thing we've talked about with Miami is how do you get Tyler Van Dyke back to his NFL draft, one of the top prospects form? How do you get him back to that? And we saw that today 374 yards and 5 touchdowns. I do think that even on some of these throws, he can still get better because there were times where he threw a deep ball and he looked kind of tentative, almost hesitant to make that throw, didn't get everything into it that maybe he could have. And that's only going to get better with the trust in his receivers, the trust in his play caller. That will get better. And that's really exciting if you're a Miami fan. I think that this is a team that has a ton of potential in an ACC that appears to be wide open with some of the teams we talked about. We already talked about Clemson. They don't exactly look like the Clemson of old. So that's something to keep an eye on. Miami is obviously one of those teams looking to get back to the top of the ACC. Won't be easy still, even with Clemson's struggles, but that's definitely something they're reaching for in 2023. And so far, they're off to a great start. For the Texas A&M, the offense, I think it did a lot better, but it was the defense that really let them down. Giving up 48 points and 374 yards through the air is not what we expected. I think a lot of people, including myself, thought this defense could be one of the best units in college football, and that just simply wasn't the case. Poor tackling was probably the biggest issue with this Aggies defense. I think there were a number of times where they could have, yeah, they gave up a big chunk of yards, but they made it worse by trying to shoulder tackle, not wrapping up, and just poor discipline when it came to ending the play. And that's what allowed Miami to get a lot of extra yards after the catch. I think that was something that killed Texas A&M at the worst times. I think that you're looking at a team that needs to do better, and especially with this offense, because let's talk about the offense. The offense looked good at times. I think that some of the turnovers were obviously bad, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. But the Aggies offense looks like it's a Bobby Petrino offense and not a Jimbo Fisher offense. And that's good. But if the defense doesn't do its part, it doesn't really matter. You're still looking at a team that is struggling on one side of the ball versus the other. And for once, it feels like it's the offense that's thriving, but the defense isn't doing its part. Now, there are some things that they still need to work on. I think Connor Wegman had a good game overall. Yeah, there were turnovers, and I get that. But I think the first interception isn't his fault. It was not his fault. The second one, yeah, you can blame it on him. It was at the end of the game where you have to throw. Miami knows that you're throwing. I don't know. At that point, I don't really care to debate that. The turnovers obviously didn't help, but one of them's not really on Wegman. You can't really do anything about that. But the turnovers really killed them in the end. That's really what hurt them a lot. But I think you look at what this team did. You have a lot of exciting players. Evan Stewart obviously showed out again. I think Ruben Owens could be a star. He had a great game. I think that the fact that this offense looks light years ahead of what it was last year says a lot about where this team is headed. So that's definitely something to keep an eye on going forward. We talked about Connor Wegman, 31 of 53. Maybe you want him to be a little bit more efficient, but I think that he was decisive. I think he made a lot of good reads, a lot of good decisions. And like I said, the two turnovers we talked about already, but 336 yards and two touchdowns. And I think that he is obviously still getting settled into this new system. And I think he'll be just fine. He'll be a fun player to watch through obviously his first interception of his collegiate career, bounced back from that pretty well in the next drive. So that's something that I kept an eye on. How do you respond to something like that? And then just simply, he just got beat by a better player today. Tyler Van Dyke was phenomenal, 21 of 30, 374 yards and five touchdowns. Van Dyke looked like that potential top 10 pick that we used to know a couple years ago. And there's still some work that needs to be done to get back to that. But you saw the confidence of the guy that he used to be. And that's what we really need to see for Miami to be better. This offense has plenty of players that can take a step forward and help out. And offense and defense did their part today. We're looking at Tyler Van Dyke was obviously the first one to do that, but the wide receivers were incredible. And I think everybody had their eyes on Colby Young, but two other guys really stepped up. Xavier Restrepo finally became the player that everyone expected him to be. For a couple years now, we wanted him to be this dominant slot player that was super explosive, and that the team just didn't really allow him to do that. The system just wasn't what he wanted, or he just wasn't playing his potential. We finally saw that. 6 catches for 126 yards. He was making Texas A&M's life miserable, and he was just one of the players that was doing it. Now, Kobe Young had a decent game, but it was not the best game of the best wide receivers here. Jacoby George had a phenomenal game, 5 catches, 94 yards, three touchdowns. He was also one of the players that had a catch that was going for 20, 25 yards. Texas A&M decides not to wrap up, and all of a sudden he's running for another 30 yards for a touchdown. He was a bright spot for this team, and I think that for the first time in a long time, you can say the wide receivers are an asset. You can say the wide receivers are a strength of this offense. So that's really exciting if you're a Miami fan. That's really exciting for Shannon Dawson. That's really exciting for Tyler Van Dyke. And the Hurricanes are really in need of that. I think the rushing attack was, if you want to point something out as technically a weakness, they're maybe just not as good as the passing attack today. However, Henry Parrish looks like he might be in the best shape of his life. He is the most explosive I've seen him, and he was making some big plays, and they have depth at that position too. The defense, maybe not the best performance, but still made a number of plays. Cameron Kinchins, hopefully he's okay. I haven't looked for an update yet on his status going forward, but I hope that he's okay. I hope his injury is not too serious. He had a good game, added another interception to his resume. I think this defense played super physical. Definitely a lot of trash talk going on. This was a confident group, a group that made life miserable for Texas A&M at times. But I think that this is a group that also can improve a little bit, get a little bit better, and that makes this team better as a whole too. Evan Stewart, we already talked about him for Texas A&M. I think there were a couple guys that stood out. Stewart is one of them. Ruben Owens, we already talked about. We talked about Connor Wegman. There were guys that stood out on both sides, and Texas A&M just has to figure something out on defense because there's too much talent on this defense for that to happen. There's too much talent on this roster for that to happen. And Miami obviously took care of business. They had a ton of recruits at the game, and that was another win for them. And now it's just a matter of figuring out how to build them on that momentum. Texas A&M has to figure out what do they need to do to figure things out defensively. How do they fix things? Because it looks like they've got some things figured out offensively, but for the defense to take a step back is disappointing. But huge win for Miami. I think there's a lot of good things for Miami to work with. I think there's also a lot of good things for Texas A&M to work with. So I think it's just a matter of figuring out what works, what do you need to fix, fixing those things that didn't go right, and finding ways to build upon the things that did.